Hello, my name is Kai, and I am a bit of a rambler. I like to travel, learn, and tell stories. And today, I want to talk about Palfish some more, because I had so many experiences and so many interesting students, and I learned so much more about Chinese people after I had lived there for so many years that I want to tell you about some more of my students / conversation partners. So any of these conversations couldn't progress to anywhere meaningful, even if the person was looking for help, until they accepted that maybe they were not seeing a comprehensive picture of their issue. Maybe they weren't seeing it from enough angles to acknowledge that there was another path they could take. And two, I would characterize as overbearing aspects of living as a Chinese person in China is the do it the Chinese way and then family. And I know I started going into this last time, and family is a huge problem because it's often not a very healthy environment. Now, I know some Chinese people who say their parents are supportive, and I have met one set of Chinese parents while I was living in China that appeared to be truly supportive of their kid doing a different type of thing, but it's very rare. What is far more common is berating your child, teasing them, making fun of them, or just insulting them until they do the thing they're supposed to do, according to a normal Chinese relationship. The closer you are with someone, the more likely you're supposed to insult them, and the more responsible you are for your part in the relationship, the more you should berate the other person so that they conform to what society expects of them according to Chinese culture. Now, this does not sound very flattering, and like I said, it's not universal, but this was a very common problem that got brought up on Palfish, that my students or people just looking for advice, a lot of these people were older than me by like 10 or 20 years, would tell me that their parents, every time they went home, would begin to berate them about the same thing they berated them about last time. Why don't you get married? You have to get married. You're too fat. Look at your belly. You're much too fat. You can't eat so much. Stop eating. You're too fat. And that wasn't like a one-time thing, and it wasn't so much tough love as just insults. And I remember this one girl who told me she could barely go home anymore, but she kept going home. But it was becoming very difficult for her because every time she went home, her mom would tell her how fat she was. And this girl sounded very depressed. Also, the fat one is crazy, and it's extremely common in China, but they're a whole generation that just came out of starvation, like literally because of Mao Zedong. So when the grandparents or parents are telling their children that they're too fat, they mean like 20 pounds, 10 pounds, like a little chubby maybe. Chinese people are pretty thin because of the famine thing. I mean, that played a huge part of it. But that generation that went through Mao Zedong's constructed famine see anything as, like, any extra fat is too fat for Chinese people. Like, even the just regular healthy weights of many countries are unhealthily fat for Chinese culture, Chinese society, I guess. And the parents just won't stop needling or blatantly insulting. Every time this girl I'm telling you about would come home, her mom would say, still fat. Stop eating so much. And then 30 minutes later, she'd walk back in the room. Still fat. Stop eating so much. And she'd leave, then come back. Your aunt is here. She's not going to be happy how fat you are. And then the girl would go out and say hello to her aunt. And her aunt would say, "Oh, she's so fat." And her mom would say, "Oh, she is. She's too fat. She has to stop eating so much food. You have to stop eating so much food." And then the aunt, "Stop eating so much food. You're getting too fat. Why don't you listen to your mother about not eating so much food?" And that's basically how this girl's life went. And I didn't ask, but it's very likely that she was 10 pounds, 15 pounds overweight. It's very likely that she was just what would be acknowledged as a healthy weight in many countries, within a range of health. Because I dated Chinese girls who gained just a healthy amount of weight. No protruding belly, no double chins, nothing really. And when we would go home, or to their house, their Chinese parents would say, "Ah, look, she's so fat now." Like out loud in front of all of the family members and everything. And the whole family would laugh, and a couple of them would say fat, and the girl, who was not fat at all, would laugh, and then they would move on for 30 minutes or until someone else walked in and said, "Oh, she's dating an American. Is that why she's fat?" Because that's just how families treat each other in China. And again, not 100% of them, but boy, a lot of them, and a lot of them that I met were that way. And it doesn't start when you're an adult, or it just begins when you're a kid, and then they insult you about the things that don't fit in to proper Chinese society, until they die or you die. Now, this is considered being close to your family, when you insult them to fix, in quotes, something that's wrong with them. Too fat, make fun of them. No boyfriend, make fun of them. Crying from a difficult day at work, make fun of them, or shout at them to be strong. But there's not a lot of intimate, emotional talk between parents and children. It's the stick, vocally, even if they're just talking to you, even if they're not hitting you, and a lot of parents hit their kids. Like most Chinese parents I know hit their kid. Maybe not crazy, but certainly swats are very, very normal for children in China. And this was a part of why dating was difficult for me in China, because I had to find the few women who had recognized how harmful that system was, and so they didn't enter into a relationship looking to attack their partner, which is very common. Chinese people get into a romantic relationship, and within days, the boyfriend's talking about how she's too fat, or she's talking about how he's too dirty, and she talks about how he doesn't make enough money, and he talks about how she doesn't clean the house enough, and they'll just insult, get into these huge fights. And then after the explosion of like a screaming match throwing things, everything will kind of settle, and it'll be calm for a day. And then the little insults will start again. Everything will just build up, and it's this crazy, crazy, toxic romance built on needling and insulting the other person. And I got into a relationship with a couple girls like that, and as soon as I figured out, like, oh, okay, you're doing this, I just politely declined to continue that relationship. So anyway, there was this one girl, Ariel, and her parents, she was the one who would go home, and her parents said she was too fat, to the point where she was getting really depressed because she was Chinese, so she had to go home every holiday, and she lived close by, nearby in the city to them, so she had to go by for every holiday, and every birthday, and every occasion, really, or just if her parents call, she had to go over. And I told her, in other countries, that's not how parents talk to their children. And I explained to her that in a lot of countries, once children become adults, you are speaking with another person on the same level. Sure, your parent's always going to be your parent, and you are always going to be your parent's child, but you can have real, on-the-level conversations interacting as adults. And I had to explain that concept to most of these Palfish students who wanted to talk about life, because having a family who sees you as a child your entire life is such a confining environment in which to grow up and develop as a person. Like, so many Chinese people, adults, act like children because they are children. Like, a significant part of their personality is still made up to be a child relative to their parents. There's this really interesting book actually called Nation of Giant Babies, I think. And it's by a Chinese psychiatrist or psychologist, I believe. A Chinese psychologist who noticed how weird it was that despite being middle-aged, all of his friends would throw tantrums, and their parents would treat them like babies, like all the time. And his middle-aged friends let their parents do that, and they never talked back to them. They never interacted with their parents on an adult level. It was always an obsequious authority and underling possessive relationship. It's called Nation of Giant Infants or Nation of Giant Babies by Wu Zhihong. And it's a very interesting book, and it tries to figure out what happened between Mao Zedong and the family structure, so like historically and psychologically, and then how Chinese civilization works to perpetuate that sort of inculcated helplessness in many members of Chinese society. And then they do it to their children, so their children grow up to be baby adults. And I recommended this book to a lot of Chinese people, but I think the book was banned at some point. Yeah, it looks like it was banned a couple of years after it was published, or nope, about a year after it was published, and then it's still banned in Chinese bookstores. You can find it online. People can, so it certainly became an interesting topic of discussion in China because there's no denying when you see someone throwing a tantrum in the middle of the road after a car accident, like literally sitting down on the road, slapping their hands on the ground and screaming, and they're like 45 years old. Or you're walking down the sidewalk and a 25-year-old boy and girl, like young adult couple, are slapping and screaming at each other like they're on the playground, just in total public. And you don't see that stuff all the time, but you certainly don't see it never. It's not super rare to see someone throwing a tantrum in the middle of the street or a couple really arguing with each other in public. But they grow up like that. Everyone around them grew up in that same Chinese society, and they're acting the exact same way. It's also an extremely monocultural country, so you don't have different cultures walking down the street by you, and you can just look over and be like, oh, they're living differently. What does that mean? You'd never see that in China if you're a Chinese person because it has such a low immigration rate. You basically only see other Chinese people who grew up in Chinese society. So something like a public fight between a boy and a girlfriend slapping each other and shouting and stamping their feet most Chinese people wouldn't bat an eye. You would just like walk around them as if there was a pothole in the sidewalk or something, like an uncovered manhole. You just walk around them and keep going. Or when you go to your friend's house, you walk in the door and then their mom or dad just starts insulting them about how lonely and pathetic they are and they don't have a girlfriend or boyfriend. Why won't they get married? Just get married already. Please get married. And you just have to stand there and wait for them to finish with the insults. And then when they're done, they'll stop insulting their kid for a while. And I have a very difficult time standing by because they just seem like bullies to me. The parents just seem like bullies to their children. And a couple times, my girlfriend would get, "You're too fat." And I would have to say, like, she's very healthy now. And that's just me saying that. I'm basically like inserting myself into the line of fire that they're aiming and firing at their child is really against the rules. But since I'm a foreigner, I get carte blanche and I can kind of put myself into situations. Because I'm there too, and I don't want to be incredibly uncomfortable while I have to wait for my girlfriend's parents to stop insulting her, to stop traditionally insulting her. Because it's not just tradition, it hurts the people. It hurts the people being insulted. But they just think that's the way it is. So when this girl was telling me about her aunt especially, because when her aunt would show up, then it would be, oh my gosh, you're right, she's so fat, I can't believe, no wonder she's not married yet, and all this kind of stuff. She really hadn't thought of minimizing her interactions with her family, or even reducing the amount of interaction she had with her family, because you simply don't do that in Chinese society. You show up whenever they ask you to, and more besides, and you are obligated to be physically close to your family and take whatever abuse they give you. That's how Chinese children operate in their family, as far as the ones I talked to on Palfish and the kids I know. Like, I know one guy whose mom bought him a condo with a 30-year mortgage without telling him, and she bought it in his name, so he was now registered to a mortgage from one day to the next. He got home and his mom was like, okay, I got you a mortgage because you're not responsible enough, so now you have a house and now you can get married, okay? And he did get married, and he's still paying off that mortgage. And that's not very weird. It's just you would accept that your parent has controlled your life because that's how Chinese parents are. They control your entire life, and you're not allowed to talk back. But what I would tell every single one of my students who would bring up a story like this was, you can fight back. You can defend yourself. You can take control of your own personhood and make sure they understand that you have your own boundaries. And as soon as I would say something like that, Chinese person will be like, no, I can't, because that's not how Chinese society does it. We cannot talk back to our parents. Well, maybe you won't talk back to your parents, or you're choosing not to talk back to your parents, but you can talk back to them because you are 27. They can't tell you what shoes you're allowed to wear and not wear, and they can't tell you which dress you're allowed to wear and not wear, and they can't tell you what food to eat. They can't actually control you because you are 27. You are an adult who gets to make their own choices. If you can make your own choices and stick to them, even when your parents try to control you in some way, you will feel better about yourself and consequently about your life. And then they'd say, yeah, but I can't fight with my parents. I can't tell them no, because that's not how Chinese people talk to their parents, regardless of our age, as an adult or a child. And I say, that makes perfect sense to me. I know it is your culture, but you are very depressed and upset because your parents won't stop insulting you over matters that you aren't upset about in your life. They're just judgments of your parents that you, as an adult, can choose to listen to and acknowledge or not. And this girl Ariel, when it's just insulting and that's the whole problem, which was a lot of it, like a lot of the students who wanted to talk about their family. Like I said, after I explained how other families didn't interact like that in other countries, and they got over the shock that the way Chinese parents treat their children is fairly unique and not how all parents around the world treat their children, then they would start listening to these alternatives. And again, when it was something simple like just, they will not stop insulting me, then what I would usually do is try to convince them, go home less. Stop going home so much. And when they insult you, stop saying, yes, I know I'm fat. I know I'm stupid. I know I'm any of that stuff. Tell your parents, please stop saying that. And don't start shouting with them. That'll just start everything back up. But if they say, that dress is so ugly, you just say, I like this dress. But the dress is too expensive. It's not a good dress. It doesn't look good on you. You just say, I like this dress. Leave it there. So none of these things were how to argue with your parents in China, because First of all, I'm not Chinese, so I want to be careful in the advice I give to people, but so many of these adults, like late 20s, early 30s, sometimes 40 or 50-year-olds, were really depressed, really upset by the relationship they had whenever they went home. And they could go home 24 times a year. They could go home twice a month, easily, sometimes once a week, and they'd have to deal with this barrage of insults every time they went home. So for someone like Ariel, I would not encourage direct confrontation because that's just a step too far. That's so far out of the realm of Chinese family relationships that it just wouldn't work. Like, they probably wouldn't actually confront their parents and argue with them directly. Like, it can evolve into a shouting match between parent and child. That's pretty common, but there's no constructive progress being made. It's just shouting and shouting and shouting until one of them stops or they both get tired and it's time to eat. That's a huge one. Well, let's just eat. Okay. And so the roles haven't shifted at all. Even if you shout back, unless you're making some kind of constructive progress on how their relationship is viewed by their parent, how they are viewed by their parent, it's just a shouting match between a kid and their parent. So instead, for Ariel, just say, I like this dress. No matter how many times her mom says something bad, I like this dress. Because she does like that dress. She thinks it looks good on her. That's a lot more important than whatever her mom's going to say. Or her aunt. And she didn't like when her mom talked to her like that, but she really hated it when her aunt talked to her about being fat, because she wasn't even a direct parent. She was just someone who would come over and cheerlead her mom on to make fun of her weight. And everybody's different, but Ariel saw that particular family dynamic as a step too far. She thought she could deal with her mom talking down to her or making fun of her, but when her aunt joined in, she got so upset and depressed and angry, but she didn't know what to do. And I told her, just stop going. You still have to go home like 20 times a year. China has so many holidays and there's birthdays and your parents are going to call you and all of that. So tell your mom that if she invites your aunt, then you aren't going over to the house because your aunt makes you really upset. And Ariel would say, well, I have to go, because it's part of... But you are going to go back anyway. They're going to go home a lot. But if they can make, one first step where they just don't go over when the person who makes them cry every time they talk to them is definitely going to be there, do that. At least don't show up once. Get just a little bit out of your life. And that's usually how I would deal with my many, many students who called up and told me that when they interacted with their aunt, uncle, mom, dad, grandparents, whatever, they would get so overwhelmed and upset that they would just go in their rooms and cry or scream or shake with rage, but without doing anything. I just had to give them something, some first step. Many people can figure out how to solve their own problems. They just have to take that first step. It's like travelers. So many people can figure out traveling, but they have to leave the country first. If you don't fly, if you don't go to the other country, then it's going to be this impossible crusade into the unknown. But when you land on the ground, no matter how you do it, anybody who lands in a country, there's this veil that drops away where they see a shop and they're like, okay, there's a shop, there's food there and water. And then they see a street and there's cars going on. They're like, okay, so people take cars. All that's real, but it's so common for people, because those are the questions I get. I know so many travelers, and first-time travelers always ask questions that seem ridiculous once you land. Well, do they have bread? Yeah. And I can take Taxis? Yes. And they have schools there, right? Yep, they also have schools. What about water? Yes, they have water. And do they have shops? Yep, there's shops everywhere. But if you've never traveled, then it might be difficult to imagine how similar countries are to the world you already know. So any person who's going to travel, the most important, or any person who's going to start something new, most important thing is to encourage them to take that first step. After they take the first step, they know what a step is. They can take the second and figure out the rest from there. But that first step is so difficult for so many people to take, whether it's a hobby they've always wanted to start up, or asking someone out for the first time, or just telling their parents, I don't like it when you say that. Most Chinese people have never said that to their parent in their life. They've never said, I don't like that, or it makes me feel bad, or stop saying that to me. Whatever it is, they just say yes, yes, yes. So if I can get Ariel to just tell her mom, I'm not coming over when my aunt is here because she makes me feel bad. Or when you talk about me being fat, it makes me feel bad. I want you to stop it. If they can just say it once, so many times on these calls, they would say it. And then as soon as they said it, they would start thinking of ways to improve that situation. Okay, she told her mom it feels bad when her mom calls her fat. Even if her mom keeps calling her fat, at least she is starting to fight back in her own way, because obviously all of these Chinese people are going to know better how to navigate Chinese relationships with their parents than I am, a non-Chinese person. But I can just get them to take the first positive step toward self-recognition, recognition of their own values, and a proud defense of their own values. And Ariel's didn't really work with telling her mom it makes her feel bad, because that's a pretty foreign concept. If you view something like your child as your property in China, which is how they view their children, then that makes me feel bad doesn't have much of an impact, because I don't care what it makes you feel like. Stop being so fat. You're manipulating a thing you own. The parent is manipulating the child they own rather than engaging with another person. They're engaging with a possession that needs to be controlled. But what Ariel did do was tell her mom that she wasn't going to come home when her aunt was there. And she actually did that. And she called me up like 2 weeks later, and, everything hadn't changed. Her mom still insulted her, and she even saw her aunt a couple times. But what was important was that she told her mom that if her aunt came, then Ariel wasn't going to go home and meet them. And that changed how Ariel interacted with her parents. Like, she basically grew up that day. And she told me she felt better, even though it was still difficult a lot of the time. Just the fact that she had taken that first step in reifying her own boundaries and self-worth, she knew that she could keep doing. She told me she was going to talk to her dad and ask him to talk to her mom. And she started figuring out all of these other things. So anytime I spoke to Ariel or someone like her, which was nearly every person I spoke to, who was having trouble with their parents, continually berating and insulting and not taking them seriously, not listening to them, I always gave positive encouragement that led to a first step. Positive encouragement and a first step. I would say this is a small thing that you can do that fits within your relationship with your parents, but establishes your own self-worth, your own values, your own identity. And I taught on Palfish for years. And so I was often working as like this half a therapist capacity, for 4 or 5 years or something altogether. And every time I got a call back and they said, I talked to my dad, I told him, or I talked to my mom and I asked her all this stuff. Amazing. So worth it. And I was getting a little bit of money also, right? I set my things, I'm getting $10 an hour talking to these people. it was a lot of time, like, convincing even just one person that the world they thought they were living in was not actually complete. It was just one tiny sliver of how humans interact and how the world carries on. So it takes time to convince someone that the world they see is not actually the complete world, because we all wear fishbowls on our heads and think the world is inside of the fishbowl. But it was also fun for me to do that, because I was broadening someone's perspective. It was a dynamic effort. I couldn't say the same thing in the same way every time, even if it was something I said like Chinese people would say, well, Chinese people eat rice, so you wouldn't understand. And then I could always bring up, oh, well, I ate rice almost every day growing up in the United States. We just liked rice more. And every time I said that, the Chinese person I was talking to, their brains would be like, click, like sort of shudder a bit. And they'd be like, what? What do you mean? What do you mean you ate rice? You ate rice in the US? And I just explained, like, yep, we liked rice. We ate rice. And even that was enough that they'd be like, okay, so how do I talk to my parents? But you can't always say everybody's different. They all want to hear. They all need to hear things in the way they understand particularly. So basically, I was just always finding a way around the belief that this is the way it was. So my Palfish students would say, like, well, that's how we Chinese cook. Chinese cook with oil. And then I'd say, oh yeah, so do Americans. And they'd laugh and say, no, Americans eat pizza, sometimes hamburgers. And they didn't mean eat pizza and hamburgers and other food. I met multiple people in China who were shocked when I explained to them that Americans didn't only eat pizza and hamburgers. And one of them straight up said, oh, also spaghetti, right? Also idali-mian. And I was like, nope, that's just a third food, but we eat Chinese food, we eat sushi, hot pot, spring rolls, tacos, food from everywhere. And they were like, what? How? Why? Are you sure Americans don't just eat pizza and hamburgers? Yep. Americans eat all kinds of food and cook in all kinds of ways. Right, but Chinese people cook with oil. Yeah, Americans cook with oil too. What? It was really fun, and I made progress with a ton of people because all I had to do was show them the world was larger than they thought it was. And then they were like, oh, okay, he can see something I can't, so I can tell him my problem. And then I get to offer some kind of advice that fits within their lifestyle as it's going on, but gives them a sense of self-worth or allows them to see their own path to walk down or their own way to build themselves up and make sure they valued their own feelings and their own opinions and their own personhood. So those were probably the most common ones. A Chinese person would tell me how their parents were emotionally abusing them, and then I would give them just one first step that I knew they could do, or I was pretty sure they could do. You know, I didn't know these people, but I was like, okay, they can say no for the first time in their lives, or they can stop going twice a week to their parents' house because they have 12 sisters and brothers, and it sounds like those siblings aren't helping with their parents at all because you're doing all of the work. So just tell your sisters and brothers you need help with your parents. And the interesting thing here was because the Chinese families were not actually close, when these students I would talk to would take that first step, like everyone in the family started acting differently. They were like, what just happened? It was like if this person picked a flower of an unknown color that nobody had ever seen before by setting a boundary for the first time anyone in that family had ever heard of what a boundary is. And everybody saw that new color on the flower and they were like, oh my God, there's a new color. So all of the way they saw the world was different. And in the same way, if Ariel set a boundary, I'm not coming over if my aunt is there because she makes me feel terrible. then now all of their interactions were different because it's the first time in her life, she's like 27, that she has told her mom she's making a decision as an adult. Never has made a decision as an adult within her family before. It is wild, but it's not just 27. Like I said, it's like 40, 50-year-olds. Okay, so Ariel's was a pretty common problem, and I would get them to take that first step to establish themselves, but sometimes the calls were a little more complex. So there's this woman, Kim, who called me up, and she sounded frantic but restrained, like on the edge, I guess, which is how a lot of Chinese people sound. They're really stressed out because their work is terrible and their family dynamics are often terrible and they just have difficult lives. So this woman sounded a bit desperate to see something different, or desperate to see a way out of the predicament she was in. And she told me one thing and then another, and there was just a much bigger story to everything. So she was with her husband. They had gotten married that year, and she was happy. She loved him. She knew he loved her. But they had just had a baby a few months ago. She had birthed a baby a few months ago. And he was working and did not help watch the baby ever. She watched the baby all the time. And her mom didn't help her, and her dad didn't help her, even though they lived in the same town. And none of her sisters, none of her siblings helped her out. And another huge problem was that this woman was a businesswoman by trade. Like, she was in charge of an entire department before she got pregnant. And she was really worried that she was going to lose her professional career and just not get it back. Because in China, once you are pregnant, that's your job as the woman. You take care of that baby. And you just do what your grandma and your mom tells you to do, and you just do that. And that's like your whole life now, no matter what you were doing before. So she was terrified of that happening, and it was happening. Now it was like the 3rd month since her child was born, and she still wasn't getting any help. Her mom just told her, like, this is what you're doing. You're taking care of your kid now. But it was her husband's kid too, and he wasn't contributing at all. He would get home and he'd be very tired from work because he hated his work. But he knew, as a Chinese man, he goes to work, gets the money, comes home. His wife will take care of the baby. He goes to bed, and then he gets up and goes back to work. And she felt they were growing distant. And then she had very, very close friends, like lifelong friends that she grew up with, still in the same town. And they were all going on a trip they had been planning for years, basically. And it had finally come together, and she was part of the friend group, so 5 of them were going to go to this island for vacation, which they'd wanted to do for so long. They'd been talking about it for so long, but now she was pregnant, and she couldn't go. And then she had a secret. The last twist in this issue was that her daughter, who she gave birth to, almost died in the canal, and maybe the cord was wrapped around her neck, I think. So the baby wasn't breathing when it came out, but the doctors got the cord off, and the baby started breathing. And this woman, Kim, who had just given birth, when she heard the baby cry after basically being dead, felt such an intense, I'll call it religious, even though there was no religion involved, spiritual experience with her new child, that even though she was absolutely exhausted and she knew she couldn't keep going at the pace she was going and doing all the work herself, because of this miraculous birth, she felt so close she couldn't not do anything, even if she knew it was making her unhealthy, because she was never sleeping and she was really stressed out and she wasn't going back to work, and she felt less valuable as a person herself because she wasn't contributing to the house monetarily, which is what she was used to. She was like 35, something like that. She had been working for a long time. So it took us like 2 hours for me and Kim to even like get on the same page. And I had to keep asking questions and finding out exactly what her limits were and what the relationships with the other people in her life were. The kid, like I had to get the whole context before I could say anything, because pulling one thread in that jumble meant affecting everything else. But eventually, and she said much more than this, but eventually those are the components it kind of broke down into. She had a new baby. She wasn't getting any help. There was this huge trip that she wanted to go on with her friends that they'd been planning for years. She really wanted to start working again. She was way too exhausted from the baby to even think of working, though. And then her and her baby, in her mind, had this mystical connection that she felt enslaved her to this child that she loved, but she was aware that she was giving herself away, that she had no control over this because her and the baby were one. They were connected in this death to life moment. And I was like, man, that's so much. That's such a difficult problem to tackle. But she was worth it. Every time I talked to one of my students, they were almost always, I'll say, worth it. The problem was worth me trying to figure out what first step I could give them, or what advice I could offer that could do no harm. Now, with Kim, there'd be more than one thing, because she had a lot of really important things to deal with, and that she was dealing with. I felt the first thing I had to talk about was the mystical connection with her baby, though, because it had been a few months, which is a long time, but I felt like if she could fix that enslavement, she characterized it as enslavement or indebtedness. She felt like she had to do like she and her baby were connected for whatever. And I felt like if I could just deal with that first, it would make dealing with all the other stuff easier. Because if she's sure that this mystical moment happened and her and the baby are magically connected, that's going to be like a force field around every other problem, because no matter what happens, she'll just do the traditional conservative child rearing life, and that preempts any solution for all of her other problems. So the first thing we talked about was her baby. And I said, I understand what happened with you. That is an amazing story, and I definitely get how you guys can be connected through that moment where your daughter basically came alive again. But I talked to a lot of Chinese people, and you are talking about your daughter in the same way that the people who call me up, their parents, talk about them, like a possession. Now, you feel obligated to help your daughter do everything until you're worked to the bone and you're too tired to stand anymore. But you're also not talking about your daughter as a person. You're talking about her as a thing you must give yourself to. And children grow fast, and people grow fast. She's going to be 3. I have students who are 3.5, 4, and they are already developing their personalities, like very clearly. So if you insist on this 2-in-1 relationship with her, you're going to be trapped inside your obligation to her, and she's going probably to resent you not allowing her to be her own person, but she won't even know why, because this is a very common Chinese thing to be too close to your kids, smothering them, basically. So I really think the first thing you have to do is recognize that your baby, yes, she's your daughter, and yes, you have to take care of her, but she is a separate person. She is not you. You are 2 different people, and she's going to develop her own personality and be a person very soon. And this was a two-sided conversation that took like half an hour. So she was responding to what I said, sometimes asking questions or clarification. But she understood what I was trying to say. And there was like this click, and she was like, you are right. She is going to be a person. Oh, I think because I brought up her. I was like, when you were growing up, if you remember being like 10 years old and knowing like who you are and your own personhood, your kid's going to be 10 in the blink of an eye, and they're going to know who they are and want to be their own person too. So the sooner you start recognizing your daughter as a separate person, regardless of what happened during the birth, I think the healthier for her and the healthier for you your relationship is going to be. And I'm pretty sure that was what it was, and it clicked, and she acknowledged that it was going to be really difficult because she had in her mind this intrinsic magical bond between them. But during that first conversation, she said something shifted and she could see it differently. Like she did understand that her daughter was going to grow up very soon into her own person, and she remembered growing up into her own person as a child herself. So that was great. That was like the force field surrounding her entire interconnected issue was down, so now we could look at and deal with the other problems, or circumstances is probably a better way to put it. Because they are circumstances. If you just move to the side, then the circumstances change. They're not really big problems. So now that the force field was down, I said, okay, your husband, great, he works. Sure, I understand China, the mom's supposed to take care of the kid. But you have told me you don't feel that way. You clearly want to share family responsibilities with your husband. And she said, he's really tired though, so when he gets home from work, he doesn't have energy to help with the kid. And I was like, okay, but you've been helping with the kid all day, and you've worked before, so you know what work is like. It's not some magical thing that he's going off to do, and when he gets home, he cannot help you at all with the child that is his child also. So I think you have to talk to your husband, because that's what you told me. That's why you're so upset that nobody is helping you with this baby, especially your husband, who has a pretty interested stake in this kid. You have to talk to him, because you say that you guys love each other so much and you really value the relationship you have. If you keep letting him not help with this incredibly important part of your life, you'll just keep growing further distant from each other. And she asked how to bring it up to him, because she didn't want to burden him like anything like that. And I was like, nope, that's a little too much. You don't have to worry about how to say it. You just have to tell him that you need help taking care of your baby. You need him to contribute to the care of the child. And we can't really get angry at the guy or her for not knowing this or anything, because, like I said, that is how Chinese families operate and are expected to continue to operate. So everyone in his life, when he told them, I'm having a baby, what they heard is, I need to work more because my wife is taking care of a child. And so in his head, going to work and just pushing himself as much as he can at a job he hates, and then going home and passing out and just getting up so he can get back and start doing that job he hates again in 8 hours. That was the only thing now. That was his responsibility as a Chinese father. His wife would take care of the baby. So we talked about how he understood how he was going to feel about it, but pay attention to her feelings. What she knew was that they should be raising the kid together because they loved each other, they wanted to stay together, and they both loved their daughter. It was just Chinese tradition, basically, for the dad not to take care of the daughter. And she needed him to join her in moving forward with a little more progressive parenting relative to traditional Chinese parenting styles. And that all made sense to her. We talked about this, but I wasn't lecturing her like I kind of had to with your little baby is a person. They're going to develop into a separate, distinct person. After that was taken care of, once I explained to her, you feel so strongly that your husband has to help you, that someone has to help you, that this is the step you have to take. And she was like, yeah, you're right. I do have to talk to him because the relationship between herself and her husband was so important, and the relationship both of them had with their daughter was so important to her. And in those 3 months since the baby was born, it hadn't started. Their relationship had completely stalled with each other, and his relationship to his daughter and her own were stunted at best. Her because of the mystical connection, and him because he was accepting the traditional role of not interacting with your children as a Chinese father. So that was like another 30 minutes, and we just talked about how she could bring it up to her husband, that she needed him to contribute some of his time to the baby. Even if it wasn't as much time as she was putting in, which obviously it couldn't be, she needed to feel and see that he was also investing himself into their child and their relationship and marriage, and that they were a family together. Which might sound really normal to you, but that's kind of rare in China. That's why I had so many of these calls, and I kind of knew how to respond to Kim by this point, because I had talked to so many other people about similar situations, except Kim had it all happening. So the next thing was the trip with her friends that they had been planning for years, that she felt like she simply could not do. She couldn't go with her friends because she had a baby, and all of her friends had just, when they found out she was pregnant and was going to give birth to a baby a few months before they all went on their trip, there wasn't even a thought that she would go with them after that. They had been planning to go together. They knew she had a huge family and a husband, and they didn't even consider that she would choose to go on the trip with them because she had a baby, and that's the end of your life as a woman in China. And I told her, look, I don't know about this one. Like, it seems to me like you should go on this trip. You really want to go. You've been planning for it. And this kind of fits into the other thing. She was really upset that her whole family had been so excited for her to give birth to her daughter, and talked about how excited they were for the kid and how proud they were of her for becoming a mother. And then as soon as she had the kid, they all stopped talking to her. Her siblings stopped talking to her. Her parents mostly stopped talking to her, except to tell her to be stronger when she called up her mom and told her she was too tired. They said, hey, that's a mom, just do it. And she felt she went from being the object of attention and congratulations to a stranger that now had a job for the rest of her life that she wasn't being paid for. Remember, she was a professional before this. And so that was the next thing we needed to address. So I said, you should go on this trip, partly because it solves the one mystic connection we talked about. If you leave, you two will be separate. And if you'll have talked to your husband and are pretty sure he's going to help with the baby, between him and your family, your parents, and then all of your siblings, they can watch the baby for 5 days. That baby will be okay. You two, you and your baby will establish your relative independence, as far as it is, in a healthy way. You can get this vacation you've been planning for years with your friends. Your friends will be happy to see you. You'll reestablish a bit of a social life. And then you can go back and be part of a healthier family, because your husband will have helped you with the baby, and now your family also will have to help your husband because he'll be working during the day. So your mom, her grandma, can watch her while he's at work, or your siblings can watch her for a day or something like that. But this, I think she should go on the trip because it works on all of the problems she mentioned, basically. The only one that was left was her job itself. And that one was a lot trickier because her whole life was her job before she got pregnant with her new husband. After she got pregnant, surprisingly, like it's always a surprise in China because there's no sex ed. So if you're not a doctor, you're basically having sex without condoms. And then you're like, oh, why is your belly big? And like, there's a baby. What? How? Did you know? No. Okay. And then you have a baby. And that's how a lot of people get pregnant in China. Hopefully that's different now. I think, like I said, like 10 years ago, they finally started having sex ed in classes in schools. So she got pregnant by surprise, but accepted it as you do in China and just dropped her career. They liked her and they told her she can come back, but she had no idea how to do that. So we started talking about how she could get back to work. And I made it super clear that while this was important, the most important thing from my perspective was the relationship, the mystic connection with her baby, and then asking her family and husband for direct support and help taking care of the child. Because that was her. That was her personhood on a deeper layer than her job, which was very important, but probably a couple of layers out from the core of her being, which was incredibly at the end of her rope, taking care of this child all by herself, not being given any support, even when she told people how tired she was. And that was a big one. She was telling people she was really tired and didn't know what to do, but she not once asked for help from her support system or her, I shouldn't call them that because they're not supporting her family. So when we did talk about her asking them for help directly, that was another part in this first long conversation. I think it was like 4.5 hours altogether that I talked to her, where I could hear it dawning on her like, oh, ask someone, right? Which, yeah, you wouldn't do if you've never heard of someone asking for help, which you never have in China, especially not a mom. Yeah, you just wouldn't think of doing that, and she didn't. But we had a great long conversation, and then she realized she could just ask for help. And whatever they said, at least she would have a little more information and understand what the heck was going on. So now we'd dealt with the mystical connection. We talked about her husband and her direct family relatives, like her biological family, her birth family, because she had tons of siblings and, they have 2 sets of parents to ask for some help with childcare, which is very common in China, but nobody was doing it yet. And then she should go on that trip with her friends. 1, because it sounds like she needs a vacation. 2, because she'd been planning it for so long. 3, to help separate her from her daughter, just so she could see them operating as independent people. And 4, so that she could receive help from a support network she should be able to rely on. That would, just knowing that she had a small support system would change her entire outlook on this. It would seem so much more doable if she knew, okay, yeah, so my mom can watch the kid for 6 hours, or my sisters are okay watching the kid while I go to the store or something like that, if I need a minute alone. The first 30 minutes was her telling me she hadn't had a minute alone away from the baby for 3 months. For 3 months, she was just connected to that baby. So again, yeah, that separation into separate people is really important. That's why we started with that. And the last thing is her job. She still wants to work because she likes her job. She liked being a department head and she liked the work she did. And I was like, well, if you can get a support system, then you'll be able to work at least part-time. Other people can watch the kid, and you know how to get the job, and you know how to do that job. So I think we should focus on those first things we talked about. Ask your husband directly for help. Ask your parents and siblings directly for help with the child. Go on that trip with your friends. Make sure people know you are going to get a vacation. Recognize your kid as a separate person from yourself. And once all of those things are in place, then you can just go get your job because you already know how to do that. You already got a good job. You were promoted. You're good at it. So I would deal with these things first. Make sure that you're stable and healthy and happy enough. And then you can take on the responsibility of work where it fits within your hopefully new and improved life. And that's what we agreed on that first day. It was 4.5 hours, somewhere around that time. And I had just been, I can't remember if I was backpacking when she called me up the first time. But in any case, it was a different call than most I got because it was so complex. And I hadn't had a call from someone whose baby had died and then been brought back to life. But on the other hand, it was the same as all the other calls. I just had to do more at one time, and instead of one first step, I just had to give her like 3 first steps, and then she would take it from there, I assumed, because that's how it always worked. They take the first step and then realize that they can take as many steps as they want to. And she did call like once or twice after that, but very briefly, just to I think the next week she called once we had to have the conversation about her and her daughter being different people, because it was just in her mind that they were one person, that they were the same person. But she knew that was incorrect on some level now, so she just called up and we basically just rehashed that. And then she was fine. I assumed, because I didn't really hear from her for a month, 5-6 weeks, something like that. A little over a month, I think. But by the end of that big first talk and the second time we talked, she had sounded so much more prepared and healthy, just ready in general, that I was happy with what had happened. Sometimes I expect people to call back because just like I had to rehash her and her kids' personhood, like distinct personhoods, I can just tell talking to someone that we're going to have to discuss a certain topic or a certain course of action multiple times until it really sinks in that it's a real thing that I'm talking about. I'm like, yes, actually say the word no. Very calmly, very politely, but say no. Or stop, Mom. Because we'll go over and then Ariel will say, we'll call back and she'll be like, are you sure I can just tell my mom to stop hurting me? I'm like, yes, just say stop. Kindly, be respectful, and tell her to stop making fun of your weight. Or something like that. So that was not too uncommon when she called up and wanted to go over that idea again. We set our minds on ideas, and we really lay a foundation of a concept in our brains so easily. And then the more we think about it, the more we make it real. But to take it apart, you have to recognize the structure first, and then look for an inroad that you can begin to take it apart by. It's tricky, but it was a lot of fun. I liked this job. And I was, getting paid my modest $10 an hour or whatever. And so I felt like I was being valued at least. But the important part of it was still that I got to help these people, that they sounded better. And then Kim was really interesting because 2 months or something after that first talk we had, I got a call from her. And I was like, oh, wow, she actually called back. And I had been curious about her because, we talked for a really long time and we had a lot of stuff to talk about. And there was a lot of meat to her situation. There was a lot to going on. So there were a lot of questions there was a lot of, questions I had about how her situation had developed. And boy, this second time, at the end of those first 2 conversations, she sounded less suicidal. She sounded less frantic and upset and lost. And that's great. She sounded like she would be able to take a first step. But when she called me 2 months later, she was like a new person. She sounded calm, happy, confident, which was great, and capable. She sounded like she was on it. And she said, hey, I just wanted to call you up and tell you how everything's going. I actually don't need any more help, but I did want to say thank you, and I just want to tell you what everything ended up being. And I was like, great, yeah, go for it. And it was pretty cool. What ended up happening was she couldn't directly deal with the individual personhoods right away. So she talked to her husband first, and she told him, hey, I love you, I love our marriage, I love our daughter, and I need you to help me take care of her. It's too much work, I'm too stressed out, I feel bad, I'm so tired, I need help taking care of our daughter. And her husband had said that he needed to make money. He knew it was difficult, but he needed to make money. And she said, no, look, I have savings from my work. You have a little bit of money. We have enough money to at least take care of this baby. And then we can work way more when she's a little older. But right now, the most important thing is that we take care of this daughter and our relationship stays together. And I was like, yes, because all my first step policy, we had decided that she would directly ask her husband to contribute some time to taking care of their daughter. And all the rest of that she had come up with because when you take one step, you can take all the other steps. So she asked for the help she needed that he should give. And she told me he responded incredibly positively. When she told him that their daughter was more important than work and their marriage was more important than this shitty job he hated, he agreed, and he didn't quit that job right away, but he did take the baby from her and just take hours of childcare time away from her where he would look after their daughter and she could get a nap or make food or just get a rest. And even that started helping her distance just a little bit. But 2 weeks into this, her husband realized he really hated his job. And he loved spending time with his daughter. And he loved his wife. But his job was just, there was nothing there except, the paycheck. But he had always wanted to be a designer. He really liked interior decorating, and he was good at it. And so he quit that shitty job, and he actually opened his own interior decorating firm or whatever. They had savings, so he would be able to go while the daughter was growing up, like he'd be able to try and build the business. And if it didn't work, then he'd be around to take care of his daughter as much as his wife needed. And they both knew that they could get another job eventually, whatever the job was. But if his interior decorating firm started working, and she told me he did get a couple clients even that first month that he opened it. And he was just walking on air. Like, he was so happy that they had shifted their lives, that they had recognized what they valued about their lives and decided that's what they were going to focus on. And he had decided to follow his dream job because Kim had gone on her vacation because she had asked her mom and her siblings for help. And as soon as she asked, her mom and siblings were like, oh yeah, definitely, we'll watch the kid all 5 days, no problem. He can go to work and blah, blah, blah. And her husband was like, well, I'll come over in the afternoon, but for these 5 days, can you watch her? And they did. And it was it took like 10 minutes for them to work out a schedule. And then she was totally free to go on this dream vacation with her friends that she had really wanted to go on, and thought she thought her life was over. And all she had to do was ask her husband directly for help, tell her husband she needed his help, and then ask for help from her parents and siblings. And she had all the child support and cooperation and support that she longed for, and didn't even know that she was allowed to ask for until we had our talk. So yeah, she was calling me. She just got back from that vacation a few days ago, or a couple weeks, I can't really remember, but it was fairly recently. And her husband was now enjoying his job. When he needed time and she needed time, they asked one of their parents to watch the kid or their siblings, and they went out on a date. Like, they went out to dinner for the first time since they had the kid. And she was so happy, and she kept telling me how happy she was. And when she got back from the vacation, she really could see her daughter as a separate person. And now she was just trying to remind herself every time they interacted, like, okay, this is going to grow up to be a person, so I have to treat her like an individual with equal respect now. I have to start doing that now so that I don't treat her like a child for the rest of her life, because she's only going to be a child for a few years, and then she's really going to be a person. But she was comfortable with that now. That mystic connection, it was there, but she recognized it as like a nice lining, like a cute ribbon tied around the relationship instead of a stranglehold on both of them. And now, she was sleeping more because her family and her husband were helping out with the childcare, so she could sleep, she could cook food for herself, she could just take a break and get some time. She went shopping a couple times. It was so great just listening to her story. And it was pretty great that she kept crediting me and saying thank you. Did make me feel pretty special. But it was super gratifying to hear how well all of those first steps had worked out, and also how many more steps she had taken without even needing a second call, which was totally fine by me. I just like helping these people. If I can make someone's life better, if I can help them fix their own lives just by offering a different perspective or letting them know that alternative perspectives exist, that's about as happy and rewarding as I can feel. Rewarded, I feel. Anyway, she was incredibly happy and very grateful, and she was really excited about her and her husband's future because he seemed to love this interior decorating thing. She didn't even know about it, I think, until he told her. Like last month, it was something like that. Like he had been embarrassed to tell her what he had always wanted to do was interior decorating. He really liked arranging things properly inside and all that. And when he told her that and asked what she thought of all these things she was doing, and she just told him, like, yeah, you should try that then. If that's what you really care about. Like, she loves her job. So she was like, yeah, I love my job. I know that's what I want to do. If you know what you want to do, then even if you have to start over at another company. And he was like, I'm definitely starting my own company. She was like, great. And yeah, it was working out. They were both very happy. It was a pretty amazing development in what was already a very interesting phone call and story. Like, everything kind of turned out for the best for them. Every one of her concerns was dealt with and resolved in like a more satisfying way than either of us had thought they could be. And very rapidly. All of this happened within the couple of months since that first talk we had. She had a healthier relationship with her daughter. She was excited to see her husband's work evolve, his business grow, and him actually enjoy his work. She had family to help with the childcare, and she got time to herself. She got all her own time she needed. She loved spending time with her daughter, so all she needed was to take a break now and then. The rest of the time, she was perfectly happy to talk to her daughter, and she had already talked to her old job, and they were like, yeah, of course you can come back. You were great at whatever the heck it was. I can't remember. She was some kind of businesswoman. And so she had already agreed to start going back part-time and see how that worked with her schedule. So yeah, she had everything, and it was so cool to get that call from her and know how well everything had worked out. I got a lot of calls back after people took that first step, and it usually turned out pretty well. Pretty quickly, too. So this was another wonderful call to receive from someone who just needed to take a couple first steps. Great work, Kim. Good luck. I'm sure she's killing it still. Well, I'll just finish out with a few of the other people I talk to very regularly. A lot shorter stories, nothing crazy like the high school kid from the last episode or Kim here. But everybody I talked to and I was able to help, that was very satisfying. And even if I just talked to them, it was still just fun. Like, I liked talking to these people, and I was getting paid enough to continue backpacking around the world. There was Mikey, this businessman. He was like 50-something, and he just wanted to talk. But he only wanted to talk, like his life was very efficient. He had it very scheduled. So he only would call me up when he was driving home from work. And he would have been thinking about something all day. And he'd get in there with a topic in mind, start driving, and once he's driving, he'd tap my picture to call and say, "Okay, today, let's talk about passports." And we would just talk about passports for 20 minutes. And if he got bored or felt he learned enough, he would interject, Okay, I understand. Let's talk about America." And then he would just wait for me to say something. And I'd have to be, "We have a lot of forests. How many forests?" I'd be like, "Oh, okay." They were always really fun conversations, and he was so excited to talk about things. And because he had it slotted into this time slot, he really went at the conversation with gusto. And his English wasn't perfect by any means. Some of the people that called me up had amazing English, and we just talked fluent English and had fun conversations. This guy had a lot of trouble. I think he was actually from Hong Kong originally. And he had a really strong accent and just had phrases that he learned from, in school when he was a kid, 50 years ago. So they were kind of outdated, and back then the textbooks weren't super great anyway. So we just worked every time something really weird, he just said something completely wrong. I would just say it's this instead, and then he'd correct himself and then keep talking. His was just always fun. He was not worried that he was paying too much. A lot of the people would be like, "I can only talk for 20 minutes because $3 is the most I can spend on a lesson every day." He was, a businessman, so he wasn't poor, and he just wanted to get better at English because he wanted to travel one day. So, yeah, they were pretty enjoyable conversations. They were always kind of funny because he was so sincere and eager about learning. And some days he would just want to talk about what happened at his work or ask what had happened at my work if I had a similar situation. And I explained about my schools, or he'd be curious about Taiwan because I had visited Taiwan. It's really difficult for Chinese citizens to get a visa there. Yeah, and I'd tell him stories, or he'd tell me a story. Sometimes he would just talk for half an hour, and I would just sit there listening and getting paid, hearing about this other person's life, what had gone on. Maybe half an hour every week, 2 weeks sometimes. And sometimes he'd get all the way home and he'd be so excited about the conversation. Most of the times he was like, "Okay, I'm home. Kai, good to talk. We'll talk soon. Okay, bye." But sometimes he'd be so into the conversation that he would just keep talking to me. We'll say we're talking about cooking, and I could hear him opening the car, shutting it off, closing the door, walking inside and being like, "But if you are a sous vide steak, if you are cooking a sous vide steak, how does the plastic not melt?" And he would just be so into whatever conversation we were having that I could hear him, his wife would be like, "Oh, Damian, how are you doing?" And he'd be like, "I'm really good. So you boil the water first," and turn back to me. Or, I could hear his kids run up to him and hug him and say, "Hello, Dad." And a couple times I could actually hear him putting them to bed, and he'd still be talking to me, and his wife would be like, "Are you finished on the phone yet?" He was like, No, not yet. And he'd tell his kid, it was time to go to bed, and then turn to me, talk to me. "Kai, can you hang on 30 seconds? I have to put my son to sleep." "Oh, yeah, sure." And I'd just wait there for 30 seconds while I heard him say very deliberate 4 sentences to his son. He's like, "Sleep. Okay, Kai, so the steak." And he'd be whispering as he tiptoed down. Or sometimes he'd get home and he says, "My wife is there. We have to go eat now. I'm sorry. I know this was a good conversation. Thank you. I will call you up soon. Thank you, Kai. I have to go eat." And I'd be, yeah. So he was really fun, just because he was so eager and sincere about his language learning. And then there was another businessman, not much actually, he just wanted to study vocabulary. He called me very consistently, but he was really excited about all vocabulary. So he'd be like, okay, next time we talk, we'll talk about pipes. Okay? Okay. And I would just find all the vocabulary words on pipes I could find, like 100. And then we'd go through them, and if he didn't know one, we'd do that. We'd talk about that word and what it meant, and he would try to add it to his vocabulary. And then, okay, next lesson, we will study South America. Okay. And it just went on and on like that, and he just chose the next topic every time we talked, and I would get as many relevant words as I thought, and then we would discuss how the words were used and why I had chosen those ones, why they were important for him. And he would just constantly try to expand his vocabulary. He was too distracted. He was so concerned with accumulating the words. I felt like he wasn't letting them sink into his language mastery. But it was fine, whatever. I was getting paid. He was learning some new words. I just felt it wasn't as effective as possible, but everyone learns in different ways, and I think that's how he felt comfortable learning. And then I got a few smart genius kids. There are a lot of geniuses in China. They're pushed so hard as children, and if they don't break, often they break later, but right when they're like 10 to, 17 or something, if they figure out a pattern where they can get all their schoolwork done, these kids accomplish an insane amount because their school days are 10 to 12 hours long, and then they have extra classes outside of that school time where they're learning English or they're taking extra math classes or extra history. And every kid plays some kind of instrument. So there are just some geniuses. And I would talk to a bunch of geniuses on Palfish. I mentioned that space rocket kid, right? He'd tell me all about the space rockets. I didn't know anything. There was also Ithulu. She was this director. I think she was still in high school. She was like 16 or 17. But she shared some student films she made with me in her class, in her film class. And I was blown away by the cinematography and the angles she was doing, and especially how confidently she talked about movie making and about what her plans were. Like, she was talking about her future plans decades into the future, and she was like 16, or I don't know, maybe she was 18, but she was very young, and she was already making movies and good at them. And she just kept talking about how she was going to develop this skill or that. And that's one of the amazing kids who shared their work with me. And I was like, geez, how cool is that? Like, I'm getting paid to meet a future director who's killing it as a teenager, basically. There was Alariel. Alariel chose her own name. She could speak the Lord of the Ring Elven language. She loved the Lord of the Rings, and she liked the nerdy addendum. What is that thing called? The Carba Snacks. Wait, hang on. The Silmarillion. That's it. Definitely not Carba Snacks. She loved the Silmarillion and read it a bunch of times. She knew all of the history of everything in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, like the names of the gods and the sequence in which all the history of that world took place, which Middle-earth or the Elven Kingdom or everything. She just knew everything about Lord of the Rings. And yeah, she chose the name Alariel, and I was like, man, that's a good Lord of the Rings name. I mean, that sounds like one of them for sure. And we basically just talked about Lord of the Rings and other fantasy. I told her some of the fantasy books I really liked. And then I asked her a lot of questions about Lord of the Rings because it's such a vast world. And I had read the books not even recently, and I just had so many questions. And it was like I was just taking a class. She answered all of them so completely and well. It was always fun talking to her, and she always wanted to talk more because I did like the topic she was most interested in the world. I'd be fascinated to know what she was doing. I actually looked at my Palfish account to see if I could log in, but I can't even remember the login anything. But I'd love to know what she was up to, because I bet she writes epic fantasies. And she, I believe, was 16 or 15, and her English was already practically fluent. And like I said, she could already speak like Elven, and Illyriel was another one of my genius Palfish kids who called up a bunch. Oh, right, and frickin' Edward. Okay, so Edward, another genius. A genius academic, a true academic. His mom called me up on Palfish first and then asked if I could help her son with a recommendation letter that he was writing to get into a high school he really wanted to get into. So he would have been like 13, 14 at this time. And when he came on the line, she asked if I could talk to him for a second. He sounded so serious and self-possessed already. And then I saw his recommendation letter, and it was very well written. He had some mistakes, and he came across a little too arrogant a couple times. Like, you should be confident, but you shouldn't be aggressive or insulting. And he was a little bit. But it's because he's a freaking genius and he knew it. So I helped him rewrite his paper. They both loved it. Her English was pretty good, but she couldn't proofread or copy edit these papers like I could. So they were both very happy he got into that school. They called me up a couple weeks later or something for another recommendation letter for a specific program we wanted to get into. We did the same thing. And this recommendation letter, this was like 2 weeks later, and it was like he had gone up 2 grade levels in writing comprehension and literary skill. I was like, whoa, that is a fast improvement. And this went on. They called me like every month or 2 months maybe, sometimes once a week, usually correcting a paper or something like that, or a story. He loved writing stories also, especially when he was younger, and he got better so quickly. Like, it was crazy. In 1 year, he went through like 8 grades of literary skill. He was such a good writer by like the 10th time we had talked. I was just like, I don't know how much longer he's gonna need me. But I didn't tell them that because I loved reading his stuff and getting paid for it. So his mom would still call me up now and then, and I would talk to the kid, and now it had been like a couple years, and he still needed the same kind of help, but I had to work a lot harder because it wasn't simple mistakes. I had to like go over the outline and show him why it would be more powerful to put this paragraph up here or take this plot element out completely, something like that with his stories he was writing. And on the second year, maybe the third year, I think it was only the second, he wrote a full novel, like not quite post-apocalyptic, but it was like elite society and then the non-elite people. And it was well written. I don't know if the whole book would have gotten published, but I bet he could have put an excerpt somewhere. And I told him that, and the next time we talked, he had gotten something published. It wasn't a poem, but I think he got a short piece of prose published in a digest somewhere. And I was just like in awe of this kid. I was, holy crap. Because the next time he called me in like 3 months or something, he had written another book. And I proofread these entire books. And I told them if I was going to do that, it's pretty intensive. I'd have to charge them more like $20 an hour or something like that. And I was fast, but this was like real work. And the copy editing work I was doing on the side for other people was $60 an hour. So 20 was a pretty fair price. And his mom was like, yeah, sure, great. And that turned into me copy editing a lot of his stories and his full books. But I think after the second book, I was just like, holy shit. And the kid had started getting really interested in history also, real world history. And he started writing these historical analyses that were so in depth. I had to look stuff up. I had to start looking things up and then reading secondary materials so that I could connect what the heck he was talking about. And he wasn't connecting them great all the time. Like he was basically starting from a conclusion and then pulling together these historical events in those first few historical papers. But after I pointed that out, every single time I taught him something, the next time he sent me a paper, that was corrected. The other mistakes were there, or there was a new way he was thinking that wasn't entirely beneficial to his work. But then we worked on that time, and he fixed that the next time. He just kept getting better and better, and it just kept getting more and more impressive the more he wrote. He was never better than me at writing, or at least at identifying his own patterns, in English. Because, of course, he's Chinese. English is a second language, and he is writing better as a 16-year-old than most American adults I know, certainly. He's probably on the fast track to becoming a history professor. But the last time we talked, he had gotten into college. So I was like, holy crap, I've been helping this kid for like 5 years now. And he was always a genius, and now he's in college doing what he said he was going to do when we first talked when he was like 13. And he's in charge of a couple of the clubs, and he's probably finished college by this time, actually. Anyway, that's Edward. Very, very impressive kid. Wrote great books. Cared about the rules and expression of literature more than almost anyone I can think of. Incredibly impressive writer. While he was still a teenager. I can't imagine. Now his historical knowledge probably dwarfs mine. And I'm happy for it. He was always interesting to talk to and often interesting to read. A couple times I remember we'd enter into this slump where he wasn't making a point, and he was trying to connect things that weren't working, and I was just having to wade through it and point out so many mistakes. But whatever, I was getting paid decently, and I felt like I was friends with these people, so yeah, it was a good time. That was great. All my genius Palfish kids. I'm sure there were 1,000 others, but I just can't remember them. And this episode's already an hour and a half long. So I mentioned that you could hold classes on Palfish, and I liked all the weird stuff. So there's the Eye of Rakat, which might be the location of the lost city of Atlantis, because it's a concentric stone in real life, a concentric stone formation, which matches the description of historical Atlantis by Plato, who insisted that it was a real place that he visited in concentric circles. Interesting little story. I did stuff on the pyramids. I did stuff on feral children. And I would hold a class. I would talk for 30 minutes or an hour, and people would join, and for every person that joined, they paid an entry fee for the lesson of like $1. And I'd have a few bucks at the end. I'd get a couple beers and a good food, and have had fun talking about these topics I like talking about. Camping and the alcohol stove I made was a big one. People really were interested in the mechanics of how I was traveling to so many countries and hammock camping. And finally, Palfish began requiring a TEFL certificate. I think the Chinese government actually required all online platforms to start being more strict with the teachers they hired. So I had been hired on Palfish without a teaching certificate. I just applied, had an interview. They were like, I guess he's legit. And then, I was on Palfish. Took a couple weeks, I think, but that was mostly just waiting. But now they needed a TEFL certificate from all their teachers, and I was in Taiwan at the time. And since it was winter, the water park was shut off during that season. So during the day, I'd walk around playing Pokemon Go. And then at night, there was a structure I'd go up into that had power. And I plugged in my laptop, and I got my TEFL certificate over a week or two in this water park building, and just lived in that little water park and got my TEFL certificate, kept teaching on Palfish, and I just checked. It is still active. I've been thinking of using it again, but I don't know. It might be fun. Still thinking about it. Thank you very much for listening. It was good thinking about all these Palfish folks again. I hope they're all doing well. And I hope you're doing well. And I will talk to you on the next one.